tell us a story.
Yes, tell us a story. A true story.
A love story.
Well, once there was a princess.
Was the princess you?
And she fell in love.
Was it hard to do?
It was very easy. Anyone could see that the prince was charming. The only one for me.
Was he strong and handsome?
Was he big and tall?
There's nobody like him. Anywhere at all.
Did he say he loved you?
Did he steal a kiss?
He was so romantic, I could not resist.
Once there was a woman called Wallis Simpson who fell in love with a handsome prince, and Walt Disney took her as the model for Snow White.
Someday my prince will come. Someday we'll meet again. And away to his castle you'll go. To be happy forever, I know.
Mush.
Someday when spring is here, we'll find our love anew, and the birds will sing, and wedding bells will ring. Someday when my dreams come
The prince became a king, but had to give up his throne to marry Snow White because she was already married. They lived ever after in exile as the Duke and Duchess of Windsor.
Wave again, please, Your Highness.
Many years later, their love story was made into a film called A King's Story, told by the lovers themselves. It was the American film producer Jack LaVierne who paid the former King of England something like $1 million to appear in his own life story.
And I positioned myself in a part of the cinema so that I could look at the Duke and Duchess during the film, during the running of the film. And the Duchess had a handkerchief in her hand, and the Duke was holding her hand with the handkerchief in it, and all through the film kept wiping his eyes. He cried all throughout the film.
His great-grandmother, Queen Victoria's influence, haunted his childhood. He would recall his early years as being wretchedly unhappy. As Prince of Wales, he was a lonely adolescent, already weighed down by royal duties. He became the government's finest ambassador, and the empire fell in love with him.
Prince of Wales! Hip, hip,
As the Depression years rolled darkly on, he seemed a bright symbol of hope to the poor of Britain. They believed that one day their prince would come. By 1936, he had become King Edward VIII, still a bachelor at 42. His reign was to last only 11 months. For he was a deeply troubled man. He hated the ceremonial burden that went with the job, and he wanted something unthinkable in a King of England. He wanted to marry Wallis Simpson, a twice-married American woman. He had to choose between the crown and that woman. He chose her.
And I specifically asked him, did he regret what he had done? And of course he said he had no regrets at all.
He'd surrendered the throne and a personal fortune for an unknown life in exile with the woman he loved. His kingdom had shrunk to Mrs. Simpson herself.
I'm putting all my eggs in one basket. I'm betting everything I've got on you. I'm giving all my love to one baby. God help me if my baby don't come through.
Within 6 months, his younger brother, shy, stammering Bertie, would be crowned George VI. The man who never wanted to be king was tenderly supported, in this as in everything else, by the wife who was now his queen. When a pride of royals assembled for the coronation photographs, no one remarked on that conspicuously missing face. The family had closed its ranks. No one from the royal family turned up when Edward and a recently divorced Wallis were married in the south of France. From now on, they'd be known as the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, but Wallis would be denied a royal rank. Days before the wedding, the palace had announced that the ex-king would be called Royal Highness, but his wife would not. Alone at last, on honeymoon, they could contemplate the strange and unparalleled course their lives had taken. What did it matter that a kingdom was lost and a title withheld, when after all they had each other? But togetherness was not quite enough. Deeply hurt by what he regarded as an insult to his wife, the Duke sought legal advice. He was informed by a leading British lawyer that as the wife of a Royal Highness, Wallis was entitled to the same rank as her husband. But the Duke was advised to avoid a public dispute. So, the fairy tale lovers found themselves stranded. But the Duke wasn't happy on the sidelines in the Riviera. He wanted a public role with Wallis by his side. In that summer of 1937, his distracted mind was seized by a silly idea. He would take Wallis to Germany. The Duke wanted Wallis to be treated like a queen, and in Hitler's Germany, she was. Although the official reason for the visit was the Duke's interest in Germany's housing scheme.
You see, one of the things that horrified him in England was the housing situation. He was told that the Germans had done wonderful things in rehousing what had been the huge unemployment in Germany before Hitler came to power. And he said he'd like to see that.
He'd come at a politically sensitive time and against the advice of Churchill and other statesmen.
You see, he was very conscious of being very German because there was so much German blood in the royal family. He said to me once, "Every drop of blood in my veins is German." And he spoke good German. And so that he was interested in Germany, perhaps more than any ordinary person would have been.
The former King of England, manfully staying awake at the kind of concert he detested, was a propaganda gift for the Third Reich. When the Duke acknowledged cheering crowds with a royal wave, photographs froze his arm in what looked unhappily like a Nazi salute. In less than 2 years, his country would be at war with Germany.
After an absence of nearly 3 years, the Duke of Windsor is back in England. A battery of cameras faced them in the garden on the morning after their return. As you see, they are both looking exceedingly well and very happy.
Despite those valiant smiles, it had not been a happy homecoming. It was the outbreak of war that had forced their return, not an invitation from the palace. No one from the royal family met them when they landed from France. There was no royal car, not even a royal bed for the night. So they stayed with friends in Sussex. The Duke was given a war job, one that would keep him out of the way. He was assigned to the British military mission and sent back to France, where he inspected French defences, including the guns on the Maginot Line. When the Germans broke through, the Duke's presence in Europe became critical. There were rumours of a plot by Nazi agents to kidnap or subvert him. He was recalled to England. But the Duke refused to go back unless his wife was received as his equal. A post would have to be found for them both. So in 1940, with France fallen, the Windsors sailed for the Caribbean. A role had been found for them. The Duke had demanded a job, and he'd been given an ignominious one, governor of a group of tropical islands, the Bahamas. Nor had they left the problem of the Duchess's rank behind them. The Duke was entitled to a curtsy, the Duchess was not. It was not the tropical Eden it seemed. The Windsors would suffer its heat and torpor for 5 years. And the Duke's governorship would be widely regarded in diplomatic circles as a series of blunders. Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away, Britain was going through the agonies of the Blitz. His brother, King George, had overcome a speech impediment and was winning the hearts of his people.
We live in grim times, and it may be that the future will be grimmer yet. Let us then put our trust, as I do, in God and in the unconquerable spirit of the British people.
When the bombs fell, the King and Queen refused to leave London. Life in the Bahamas for the ex-king and his lady was less dramatic. Wartime newsreels made a point of showing the contrast in the lifestyles of the royal brothers. The Duke had not shared his country's hour of peril, and he would not share the moment of victory.
From early morning until late at night, tremendous crowds make their pilgrimage to Buckingham Palace to pay tribute to our King and Queen, who have shared with their people the dangers and bereavements of total war. They stand on the bomb-scarred balcony of their home, which has suffered like so many thousands of others in this our land.
The 20,000-ton American troopship Argentina, as I saw her anchored in Plymouth Sound, within sight of the shores of Britain. Aboard her were the Duke and Duchess of Windsor on their way to France. The Duke has come back from the United States, wanting a job and hoping to find a permanent home. After 5 years' absence, they can see England again.
But they didn't disembark. They were on their way back to France, and the Duke had asked if he could bring Wallace to tea at the palace to meet his family. The answer was no. He wrote to his brother, the King, asking for another job, hoping it could be in England. He was turned down. When the Duke did visit England again later that year, he came alone. He was about to turn to his last court of appeal, his mother, Queen Mary. Signs that he was still loved in his own country did not help his cause. A popular ex-king could be an embarrassment. The meeting with his mother would decide his future. Could she ever accept Wallace, a twice-divorced American, as her daughter-in-law? No, never. England was still closed to them, but at least they could live like royalty abroad. Their Paris house, with its 30 servants, cost a fortune to run, but then they had one. The Duke had made some shrewd deals on the stock market, and he was allowed to live in France without paying tax.
They lived a life of a great luxury, but he had been used to, as the Duchess said, being a bell pusher and getting everyone to answer the bell instantly. She had to provide people to do that. She probably spent a good deal of time having her hair done and that sort of thing, hairdressers, that kind of thing. And he loved gardening, and when I say gardening, not just saying I'll have pink there and orange there, but really gardening with weeding and everything.
The Duke fought off homesickness by cultivating an English country garden. In the 1950s, they bought an old mill house outside Paris and transformed it into a little bit of England. It was the place the Duke loved best. The garden was his joy. It reminded him of his garden at Fort Belvedere, the country house he'd had in England when he was Prince of Wales.
Well, in the winter, when there was no gardening in France, you see, they were nearly always in America. Well, then I think he played a lot of golf. I don't think he was terribly good, but he loved the exercise. He was very keen on keeping fit. Perhaps he'd have played less golf, if he'd been in England and he'd had a few foundation stones to lay or something, but he hadn't.
Two American journalists observed the Windsors at close range over a number of years. Charles Murphy lived with them while he helped both write their memoirs. Joe Bryan knew them socially and collaborated with the Duke on a book about his childhood. These two men were well placed to answer that intriguing question, what was it that made Wallis so special?
She had a sheen, a gloss on her. She fascinated you. She almost entranced you because she was the most wonderful hostess. She gave you the feeling that she was talking to you alone, that there was nobody else in the room. And it was always her whole attention was focused on you.
One was conscious of a presence. She made one work in her presence. She drew one out. One had to talk. One had to play up to her.
And there was something else, something the Duke needed.
He thought her so perfect. And if there was even quite a big dinner party, he couldn't wait, really, to hear what she was saying the other end of the table.
His attitude toward her was that of toward a mother mistress. He looked to her to be a mother, to mother him, to make all the decisions for him, to urge him on.
I think it was simply the fact that he liked to be told what to do. He wanted to be given commands. And God knows she was willing to do that.
Use a fork. Put that down.
Darling, get me a pencil. Darling, hand me a cigarette.
David, come up here.
Stop fiddling with your necktie, she'd say. Let it alone. Put that cigarette out. You're smoking too much. All meekly, yes, darling, and did exactly what she told him.
And the Duchess came in, looked at the mess, and said, what a dreadful thing this is. Do you realize what you are doing to this house? She said, look at this room, look at this table. In 3 hours, I will have to have 26 guests for supper. You've got to get this mess out of here at once. Why do you do this? Why don't you find some better place to work? And the poor Duke looked up and said, darling, I'm sorry. This is the only place I have to work. I hope this does not mean that you're going to send me to bed again this evening in tears.
But there was nothing Wallis could say or do that could diminish the Duke's devotion.
What you must always bear in mind, the basic thing about him was he loved the woman. Right up to his dying day, he loved her. He loved Wallis and nobody else. He was perfectly satisfied with the life that she led for him, as long as she was there. He didn't care what they did or where they went, as long as it was with her. He couldn't bear to be apart from her. She satisfied him completely. She had to amuse the Duke all the time. I think that exhausted her, really, to keep him amused. That's why their life was a series of party after nightclub after dinner and so on. She was putting on the whole act all the time, anything to keep him from being bored. But you would look at her in the moments of relaxation when she didn't have on a social face. She was bored. I think that's why she turned to Jimmy Donahue, who was an amusing, entertaining scamp, a rascal.
I think Jimmy Donahue was somebody who, like the Duchess herself, enjoyed sitting up very late, and the Duke really didn't. I mean, he liked to go to bed at 2 or something. And he made the Duchess laugh, and he perhaps was rather an unfortunate choice.
Jimmy Donahue was a very rich American playboy, heir to the Woolworth fortune, and reputed to be homosexual. He had danced attendance on the Windsors for some years, but when he began taking the Duchess out alone in New York, while the Duke was in Paris writing his memoirs with Charles Murphy, the gossips pounced.
Well, the gossip was being published in the New York newspapers. the clippings were coming back to Paris. The Duchess had subscribed to a clipping service. She forgot to cut off the service after she had left Paris. The clippings arrived, and the Duke, exercising the royal prerogative, had opened the mail and had found these references to the Duchess, of his Duchess, and Jimmy Donahue. And that so distressed him that he dropped everything and announced to me he was taking the next sailing of the Queen Elizabeth back to the United States to be with her.
The Duchess was waiting for him at the quayside. Their reunion, very public and predictably loving, quelled the gossip, but the legend had been tarnished.
It struck me as a fairy tale that had gone awry. The two had defeated each other. He had wanted from her a love that he had never known, but which she, in her nature, was unable to give him. And she wanted from him the position that she had never quite succeeded in attaining on her own, but which she sacrificed in order to marry her. So it was, in a way, a double defeat. She was the one who was discontented, it seemed to me, unhappy at the way things had turned out. And he, uneasy because he could not satisfy or persuade her that the choice he made was a choice that he valued above all other things.
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening, Mr. Marat.
That's a most attractive dress you're wearing.
The Windsors revealed more about their relationship than perhaps they meant to in a rare interview on American television.
Tell me, where is the other half of the Windsor family?
The Duke's waiting in the living room for you.
Well, could we go on and meet the Duke, do you think?
Yes, we'll go in now.
The Duchess was publicizing her autobiography, The Heart Has Its Reasons.
Well, darling.
Where have you been?
Well, David, here is Mr. Marat.
Good evening, sir.
Hello, Mr. Marat. It's nice to see you again.
Thank you, sir. It's very pleasant seeing you again, sir. Well, ma'am, to project a little, what's important to both of you for the future?
Well, for me, I want to make my husband happy. That's my greatest desire.
And for you, sir?
Darling, I subscribe to that very charming and gracious thought, only, of course, the other way around. With regard to our thoughts for the future, it is difficult to make plans for the future. I think if one leads a decent life and acts well, the future takes care of itself. There is so much to do in life and so little time to do it in.
Tell me, did you keep your fingers crossed when waiting for the reviews on your book?
Well, I must say this. It was something quite new to me to write a book, and it took me 2 years of quite hard work, so I must admit that maybe my fingers are crossed, yes.
And I was particularly impressed with the description of your grandmother. She was apparently a very considerable influence, was she not?
She was a great influence. She was a wonderful person. And she said, I think this is a wonderful thing for everybody. Conscience is like a mirror. You must look into it at least once a day.
I was fascinated by one paragraph dealing with the game of jacks. Have you had any chance to practice with the jacks I sent you the other day?
Well, I haven't had much chance to practice, and don't forget that when I played jacks, I played them on the stone steps of Baltimore, so well known. But how, if you'd like me to have a try at it on a mahogany table, I don't mind.
Good, fine.
This was a live broadcast, and the questions and answers had been rehearsed. But Ed Murrow was soon to throw in an unscripted question. It would fall between them like a grenade.
You'll forgive me if I miss, won't you?
Of course.
There, is that enough?
Thank you very much.
I hope you'll teach me that game someday, darling.
I love to.
I won't be as good as that, though.
Well, sir, to change the subject, do you two ever have occasion to discuss what might have been?
Mr. Murray, I think you must be referring to the events of 1900, the crucial events in my life, in our lives, of 1936, and are wondering whether they have ever preoccupied our minds since that time. Well, now, the answer is most emphatically no. In the 20 years, close on 20 years since we married, there have been rewarding years, years of great happiness, years of no regrets, and years when we have preferred to look to the future rather than over our shoulders into the past.
But, David, don't you remember we always said we would never talk about what might have been? In fact, I think we arranged that pact on our honeymoon.
Yes, we did, and it's a pact and a vow that we've never broken.
When King George VI died suddenly in 1952, his brother, the Duke, was not officially informed.
A reporter, or several reporters, had come to the Waldorf Astoria. We were in New York at the time, and said that the king was dead. And I thought it was a hoax because I'd been hoaxed once or twice before about that sort of thing. And anyway, eventually they convinced me that it was the fact. And so I rang their bedroom. The Duchess answered the telephone, and I told her.
Reporters swarmed over the Queen Mary as the Duke prepared to sail for England and his brother's funeral. In his press statement, however, the Duke let some of the old family bitterness show through.
This voyage, upon which I am embarking aboard the Queen Mary tonight, is indeed sad. And it is all the sadder for me because I am undertaking it alone. The Duchess is remaining here to await my return. The late King and I were very close, and the outstanding qualities of kingship he possessed made easier for me the passing on of the uninterrupted succession to the throne of the United Kingdom.
So they buried the man who'd become king only through his brother's default. It was his dedication to the throne, so they said, that had brought his early death.
After the funeral of King George, our royal family left St. George's Chapel to face the future, like us all, without their much-loved head of the family.
The dawn of a new Elizabethan age brought no change in the status of Wallis, Duchess of Windsor. Even if well-meaning friends flattered her with a royal curtsy, she knew it was not the real thing, and so did the Duke. During the 1960s, like any other well-heeled expatriate couple, they began to include London in their social circuit. And always they drew crowds. Were they not still the Romeo and Juliet of the older generation? The Windsors would descend on London in December so that the Duchess could do her Christmas shopping in Bond Street. She bought no presents for her English in-laws and received none. She still hadn't met the royal family. By now, the Duke and Duchess were both in their late 60s and fighting a personal and secret war against old age. The Duchess fortified those famously youthful looks with the occasional facelift, discreetly described as minor surgery. The Duke was in the London clinic in 1965 for more serious surgery. He had an operation for a detached retina. The Duchess came to see him every day, and every day the crowds came to see her. Then one evening, the Queen called on the Duke, and for the first time in 29 years, she met her Aunt Wallis. It was winter, but there seemed to be a thaw in the air. The Queen had sent gifts of wine and pâté de foie gras. There was speculation that these might be peace offerings. Was the family wound being healed at last? When the Duchess led her husband from the clinic, he looked frail and suddenly old. But if the Duke's health was a cause for concern, another question hung tantalizingly in the air. Now that the Queen had met Wallace, would the Windsors at long last be reconciled with the royal family? The Duke already had one answer. He'd asked if he could walk in the palace gardens and be told, yes, he could, but with his valet for company, not his wife. 2 years later, however, the Duchess was invited to join her husband for the unveiling of a memorial to his mother. The media saw it as an end to the family rift.
Now, as you all know, the Duchess has met the Queen. She knows the royal family, so that is no special event in any way.
What do you think about these stories that this could heal a break with the royal family?
We've never heard them. We don't know anything about them at all.
Still, this was the first certain sign that the Duchess was coming in from the cold. For the first time, members of the royal family were lining up in public with the Duchess of Windsor in their ranks.
For not quite 11 months, the Duke of Windsor reigned as King Edward VIII. When he abdicated, his mother was 69. She lived nearly 17 more years.
It was Queen Mary who'd been most hostile to Wallace, who dismissed her daughter-in-law as an adventuress.
It is fitting that here the present Queen should meet the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. The differences that arose out of the events of 30 years ago melted away at this memorial to Queen Mary.
For some, the royal ice hadn't melted enough. Burke's peerage demanded a proper title for the Duchess of Windsor, who has suffered the indignity, unique in the annals of British history, of being denied a social status equal to that of her husband. In 1970, when the Windsors were interviewed at their Paris home for BBC television, Wallace was still an unroyal Duchess. The Duke was asked if he'd wanted to serve his country after the war.
Yes, I offered my services if they were required. He never got me.
Would you like the Duke to have had a job?
Oh, yes, very much, very much.
In those days, that's 25 years ago.
I think he could have done something.
Why didn't you get a job, do you think?
I don't know. Have to ask. Most of the people, I think, I'm afraid, are underground now, who prevented me. Hard to say.
Do you have any regrets when you look back on your life?
Oh, about certain things, yes. I wish it could have been different. But I mean, I'm extremely happy, and naturally you've had some hard times, but who hasn't? So you just have to learn to live with that. But I have great fun.
We have a lot of fun.
Duchess, what is the secret of keeping and looking young?
Well, I don't know. I haven't got the secret yet. I think happiness is a great secret, too. How you feel and look, perhaps. We've been very happy.
We sure have. Well, I'm very happy.
The Duke had been ill with cancer for some time when the Queen made a special visit to him in Paris. The Duchess received the Queen as the Duke himself was too ill to rise. Queen spent an hour alone with her uncle before leaving with Prince Philip and Prince Charles. The Duchess seemed poised and at ease, although she was known to be suffering painfully from arteriosclerosis. The Duke was 78 when he died. The man who'd been king in one of history's shortest reigns lay in state, not in Westminster Abbey, but at his own wish in St. George's Chapel, Windsor. 60,000 people paid homage at his coffin. The exile had come home. His widow arrived from France and was met by Lord Mountbatten, who'd been the Duke's closest friend in the years before his marriage.
On 3 cushions,
the insignia of the man described later in the service by Garter, King of Arms, as sometime the most high, most mighty, and most excellent monarch, Edward VIII.
I could understand why a man might not wish to be king. There was no question but that he was bored by the prospect and did not enjoy it. But it was there for him, he had been brought up for it, and he had no right to quit it. And I felt in that respect that he had failed not only his family and his country, but himself. I felt that I was with a flawed man, charming in so many other respects, graceful, lovely manners, pleasant ways, but flawed, and never able to redeem it.
He was not buried alongside his brother and other English kings in St. George's Chapel, but in the less imposing family cemetery at Frogmore, because one day his beloved Wallace could join him there.
The strange thing is here, the way the royal family rejected her. They wouldn't receive her, wouldn't give her the title. They thrust her out of darkness. She was an adventuress. But she's going to be buried among them at Frogmore and will be among them forever, right there, and there's no displacing her from that.
The Duchess had been heavily sedated at the funeral. Now, still distraught, she insisted on flying straight back to France. A small, pathetic figure, leaving the country her husband had been born to rule. And yet, as she entered the plane, she did not look back. It was a sad end to the fairy tale. She would be lost without her prince.
They had really, they had thousands of acquaintances, but they only really had each other. And I saw the Duchess maybe a year or two after the Duke died, and she wasn't taking it well. I remember going into the house in the Bois de Boulogne where she was alone, and she said, "Jack, sit down just a minute. David is upstairs writing, and he'll be down in just a few minutes." He had been dead 2 years. Very sad.
The Duchess had entered a long decline. Some years after the Duke's death, the press sneaked a photograph of her. Technically crude, the blurred picture nonetheless showed how frail the Duchess had become. The house on the Bois de Boulogne, where she still lives, has become a silent fortress. Bedridden and paralyzed, she lives in a private world of memory. A world where a king gave up a throne because he loved her more.
But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love. And I want you to know that the decision I have made has been mine and mine alone.